Welcome to the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast, episode number 301. So I'd like to thank Bryan Haywood for coming back, jumping in. I had a person cancel at the last second. I just had him last week on 300. So thank you so much, Bryan. And I also know that when you're sitting here talking to me, that means that you're not working. So I really wanted to thank you for taking this time out of your day, sharing this stuff then. And this is a fantastic episode on what you really propose to sit down and talk about chemical labels. So just like the last one, I'm going to let you take charge and just run with this thing. So anytime you're ready, Bryan.
All right. Thank you, David.
Sure.
So this little presentation came about from some LinkedIn posts that were made by some folks that were declaring that workplace labels on secondary containers had to meet the same requirements as the shipped containers under 1910 1200 F1. And the ship containers is the new labels that OSHA came out in 2012 with the global harmonized standard. The pictograms, the signal word, the precautionary statements, the address, and all that stuff. And so if you're shipping a 55-gallon drum, then that label has to be on there, right? And it's basically non-bulk shipments. The bulk shipments, which we'll talk about at the end of this, tank cars and rail cars do not fall under the global harmonized standard. They fall under the DOT hazardous material regulations. So the purpose for this was as I started to push back on a lot of these LinkedIn posts and stirred up stirred up quite a bit. Got put in LinkedIn jail for sharing their post in my group and then commenting, and they would turn off comments on their post, and I just didn't understand it because the standard's been around since 2012. So here we are 14 years later in 2026, and we have this rash of posts basically telling everybody that you have to label your secondary container. So a secondary container is I've got a squirt bottle and I'm going to go over here to my drum of isopropyl alcohol and fill up my squirt bottle. And that squirt bottle is a secondary container. That drum that came in from a supplier, that was a ship container. That drum has to have the ship container labels, the pictograms, the signal words or word and all that stuff. But when I transfer out of that labeled drum into a secondary container, OSHA allows me to follow 1910 1200 F6, which is workplace labeling. And they give you a whole lot of options. And a lot of people took offense to the fact that I suggested that we could still use the NFPA 704 diamond and the hazardous material identification system, commonly called HMIS, which are the color-coded labels. And there's a numerical value that goes in each of the color-coded, at least the blue, the red, and the yellow. And the numbers are the same. They go 0 to 4. And then you got to have the chemical name with the diamond or the HMIS. But those are perfectly acceptable to still be used today in a workplace. Now, it goes without saying, if you're using the diamond on your secondary labels, or for secondary labeling, you got to train your people on the labels, right? Whether it's HMIS or NFPA 704, or the GHS. So when you got to train everybody. You had to have them trained by December of 2012 on the new GHS labels, because shortly thereafter in 2013, manufacturers had to start shipping with those new labels. So you had to have your people trained to be able to read the label before the container showed up. But you can still use your NFPA 704 diamond or your HMIS. And then this spun off into a whole open debate, which I thought was very good. Some people got offended by it, but I thought it was good open debate about the application of using the NFPA 704 diamond on secondary label on containers. And there was a pretty good faction of what I would say respected safety professionals that were like, nope, can't do it. It's you're misusing NFPA 704. And of course, you have to understand that that labeling system was created for firefighters, and it was created to be on bulk tanks and in hazardous material storage areas. So the fire code requires it if you had an outside flammable storage building or a storage area and you had hazardous chemicals in there, you would have to put a diamond at the entrances into those buildings or areas, as well as on bulk tanks in the workplace. Um, but over the years, even in 2012, OSHA and NFPA put out a fact sheet, a joint fact sheet, explaining how the NFPA 704 diamond could be used um, in your HASCOM program on secondary containers. And of course, there's confusion, which I still see today during audits and site visits, where the NFPA still uses a classification system. OSHA uses a categorization system. So a category one flammable gas would be a four in the NFPA 704 diamond. So they're inverted, right? A two would be a three would be a two. And, so basically you go with OSHA, you go one, two, three, four, one being the worst. And in NFPA, it's four, three, two, one, four being the worst. And that causes a lot of confusion. And so a lot of people were making the argument that it's just confusing the personnel. Well, granted, you got to remember, I was consulting by when 2012 came around, but I had spent 16 years in the chemical industry before that. And NFPA 704 Diamond was like, I mean, that was your primary label for everything, whether it be a bulk container, or a small squirt bottle, used in the workplace in a lab somewhere. That was what everybody used, and we required us to um, see if I can share here. Can you see that, David?
No, maybe it's a little slow. Try that again.
Says you have to allow multiple presentations for this meeting.
Wonder if I did something goofy on my end. Sorry, folks. Brian, if you could tell a good joke or something, we'll see if
Well,
we can figure this thing
I'll,
out here then.
I'll just keep going through it. So anyway, the debate was, can you use the old labeling schemes from prior to the global harmonized standard? And the answer is you absolutely can. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is when you use the NFPA 704 diamond, you have to put the chemical name either above or below or to the side of the diamond, to be compliant with OSHA's 1910 1200 F6. And the reason why you have to put the name is that, there's a lot of chemicals out there that have the same coding, right? The same health hazard, the same flammable, same reactivity. So, those are just numerical values to represent the degree of hazard for health, flammability, and reactivity. So the name is required so the employee can actually go look up the correct SDS for that chemical if they had other questions. In most of the HMIS labels at the top has a section called substance identity, and that's where you would put the name. And the presentation that they can download from safetyinch.net basically goes through this and gives an example of what a compliant NFPA 704 diamond label would look like with the chemical name under it. And then a little trick that I learned when I started in the chemical industry in 1993 was uh, the chemical name would be color coded as the same as the piping. So in process plants, we had to follow, well, everybody should be following it because it's in the International Fire Code, and 46 of the states have adopted the International Fire Code. And it says that all piping will be labeled per ASME, well, it's ANSI /ASME A13.1. and the pipe labeling is color coded, the text is color coded, and then there's a directional flow arrow. So yellow with black font is flammable liquids. And therefore, if I'm labeling a toluene tank, I would have the diamond, and then underneath it would be a yellow label with the word toluene in it. So that color coding matched the same color coding as the piping you would see out in the plant. And we did that for simple line break. And so there was a continuity of the labeling system all the way from the storage tank all the way to the process. Not required, but it's just a little trick that we did, and it works really well. It just keeps things simple.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and you know, the other pushback I got was that NFPA 704 diamond isn't allowed on secondary containers. And of course, I pointed out that the storage tanks that receive the material from the rail car tank truck, that's the rail car tank truck is the ship container, and it's a bulk shipment, so it actually falls outside of GHS. It falls under the HMR, hazardous material regulations. Um, and then you're unloading that ship container to a secondary container, which is your bulk tank. All right. And then when you take something out of that bulk tank and put it in a smaller container, that's also a secondary container. Um, so NFPA 704 Diamond is without a doubt allowed on secondary containers. And then we got into the debate. Well, it can go on bulk containers, but it can't go on small containers like a squirt bottle. And I was like, well, where is this all coming from? Who's coming up with these things? Because I've probably read 704 NFPA 704 probably 100 plus times in my career,
Hmm.
and written hundreds of maybe thousands of audit findings against it for improper labeling. So they started saying, well, it's just not designed for that. Well, I go and look, and there's actually in the standard, it actually talks about, and you can see this. I cut and pasted it and put it in the presentation. It says exception for containers with a capacity of 3.78 liters, 1 gallon or less. Symbols can be reduced in size provided the following. So they're literally giving you instructions on how you can apply a smaller diamond to a small container as long
Hmm.
as the reproduction is proportionate, the color coding is retained, the vertical and horizontal dimensions, the diamond are not less than 1 inch, and the individual numbers are no smaller than an eighth of an inch tall. So if you've got a container that label, a small label can fit on it, NFPA is actually giving you guidance on how to label that handheld secondary container. So again, I don't buy the fact that NFPA prohibits their use of their labels on secondary containers. Um,
Right, right.
and the last one is I've put in here, and I just updated the website with this updated PowerPoint because I was getting a lot of questions from the people who had downloaded this over the last 2 weeks. And it was, where does OSHA say that ship containers and bulk containers are different than the ship containers covered in 1200 F1? And you have to go back to a memorandum of understanding between PHMSA, Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's a September 2016 memorandum called Labeling a Hazardous Chemical for Bulk Shipments, Joint Guidance Memorandum prepared by PHMSA's Office of Hazardous Material Safety and OSHA. And I provide a link to the actual 2-page memorandum. And then in the PowerPoint, I actually going to explain why you don't have to have pictograms and signal words and precautionary statements on your bulk shipments. And this is probably going to cause another storm because a lot of people were under the impression that their bulk shipments were showing up with a ship container, and it's the ship container is for I call them 55-gallon drums or maybe even intermediate bulk containers like
Hmm.
totes.
Right,
Um,
right. Hmm.
but when you're talking a bulk container as defined by DOT, rail car, tank truck, such, ISO containers. These fall outside of the scope of GHS and fall under the guise of the HMR, the Hazardous Material Regulation. So there is a little caveat in that memo. And here's where you have to train your people on the DOT placarding system because it's still that's the system for ship bulk containers. But in this memorandum, it basically talks about having these, they call them intermediate containers. So the truck shows up on site and it's not ready to be unloaded yet, but it's sitting on site. It's no longer in transportation because you've accepted the shipment. You're just waiting for it to be unloaded. If something was to happen with that truck, the workers around the truck, the emergency response team on site or the fire department, that truck has to be labeled. Now there's a question, since it's no longer in commerce, does it have to be labeled as such? Well, OSHA and PHMSA agreed that, look, we're not going to require you to go create a label with the pictograms and stick it on a tanker truck that's waiting 2 hours to be unloaded. You just have to make sure your workforce, your emergency response team and the local emergency response team is trained on how to read placards. And those things have been around for 50 years. Um, so there shouldn't be any confusion. So basically, your HAZCOM training program should include the GHS required for ship containers, that's F1, should include the DOT placarding system, and it should include any of your secondary container labeling methods, whether that be an HMIS or an NFPA 704 diamond, or OSHA talks about using batch tickets. If you've never worked in a batch plant where today in reactor number one, we're running toluene, and caustic and all these other chemicals. Well, how are you going to label the kettle today? And then
Mhm.
tomorrow we're running toxics in there, no longer flammables. So when you're changing the use of that vessel from day to day, week to week, that's why OSHA says you can use batch tickets. So basically, what you do is you label that vessel with a large number label over top. Say like kettle number one, it would be K1, and then there's a station there for the operator, and there's the batch sheet, and on top of batch sheet, it'll say kettle number one, today's date, and it'll tell you all the chemicals that are in there and the batch ticket that the plants I worked at that were batch plants we literally would put the NFPA 704 diamond for that chemical on the batch sheet. So there's the one for toluene, there's the one for caustic, there's the one for, steam, whatever the hazard was, the constituent was, we had it on the batch ticket. Because again, tomorrow that vessel is going to hold a totally different mixture with different hazards and different degrees of hazards. So instead of having to change the label every day, you don't label the vessel with a diamond or an HMIS. You label you put the name of it over, and then that refers back to the batch sheets. And of course, you have to train everybody, including the emergency response team on site, that when you show up to that vessel, there's not going to be a diamond on it. You got to get to the batch ticket.
Right,
Um,
right, right,
and
exactly.
that is how you would meet that requirement for a process vessel, and that's why OSHA mentions batch tickets and so forth under F6.
Right, 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 right. I am really happy that I never had to do a batch system. So
Ooh.
all of mine were just fixed. And I'm sure that eventually people kind of get it down. But if you don't really have a good schedule, every day people have to literally sit down and read that and say, okay, now today I'm ready for, all that stuff then.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, when it comes to secondary labeling, so I go over the standard, I think, and I did it because I wanted to make it simple. And maybe I still don't know in my head, was I trying to make it simple for the workforce or simple for me or simple for both of us then? But I just mimic exactly what that primary is, and I make it the secondary on there. And that way,
yeah.
I'm only having to do one, and I definitely know that it's over what's out there. But one of the things that I'm just amazed at all the different chemicals out there. How can they all look like water? You know, it would be awesome if you could say, oh, if you had like add some dye to it. Like if it was nitric, I'm going to add in green, and then I know it's nitric. Now that doesn't it doesn't mean it's not less hazardous, but at least you have a indication if you found something on the floor or spilled or something like that to help you out and investigating.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Um,
the one thing that, getting back to your preference to use the GHS even on secondary labels, that is the very first option that OSHA gives you under workplace labels. It says the employer has the option to use all of the requirements that come with the ship container. So you could buy prefab labels. And I've seen some that basically the operator would then, or the employee would have to take a Sharpie or something and mark the pictograms that were applicable based on
mhm,
the drum or the tote that he got it out of or she got it out of.
mhm,
And then you would put the signal word on there, the precautionary statements. And when we started doing this back with my clients in the 2012 and beyond, almost all of them were like, well, that's going to take my operator 10 minutes, and we're going to have to buy all these rolls of these labels and all this. And so they were like, the standard allows us to continue using the NFPA, the HMIS, as we have done for 30 years. The HASCOM standard came out in 1984. So, you're pushing 30 years, where, everybody was already very accustomed to that, and they weren't so much accustomed to using the pictograms. So you still had to train your people on the pictograms, the precautionary statements, the signal words, because they were receiving product labeled like that.
right, right, right.
If you wanted to carry that over like you did, and your company's willing to invest in the machinery or the rolls of labels that, are, sometimes 10, 15 times more money than just a roll of NFPA diamonds, that's for a business to decide. You have that option as a business if you want to keep it simple, right? And just mimic on the secondary container what it came out of the label on the drum or the tote. That's perfectly acceptable. That's your first option. But OSHA does not require it. It is an option. And that's where a lot of people were getting so bent out of shape. I'm like, look, I'm not. And they were, telling me that, well, you should try to do more than OSHA. Well, I'm like, well, F1 is OSHA minimums, right? So
Right, right,
it's not
right.
like you're setting the world on fire, came up with your own labeling scheme that's better than OSHA. You're still
Right.
following F1, which is an OSHA minimum standard. And in F6, it says you can do that, or you can use some other type of diagrams, pictograms. I forgot how they phrase it, but hang on a sec, I'll read it to you. Product identifier in words, picture symbols, or a combination thereof, which provide at least general information regarding the hazards of the chemicals, and which, in conjunction with other information immediately available to the employees under the Hazards Communication Program, will provide employees with the specific information regarding the physical and health hazards of the hazardous chemical. And that's basically how you can use the HMIS or NFPA. And we see a lot of errors. I do a lot of work with a lot of flammables and a lot of toxics, and I'll walk into a room and I'll see a container that says toluene on it, and then I'll see it's a one in the flammability, and I'm like, well, where'd you get that from?
Right, right, right.
One of the biggest challenges that we have, and we could talk for an hour on this some other day, is what the Global Harmonized Standard did to SDSs. What I should say, what they did to MSDSs. Those are for those old school folks. We used to call them
Hmm.
material safety data sheets.
Hmm.
So when we globally harmonized it, we went to the 16 format section, and required that, and are called SDSs. Well, in the good old days, what would be at the top of page one on your MSDS? The manufacturer would literally put the HMIS numbers and the NFPA diamond numbers on there because they knew that's what everybody was using as their
Right.
secondary container labels.
Hmm. Hmm.
Nowadays, you know, you would be hard pressed to know what the NFPA 704 labeling or degree of hazard for health, fire, and reactivity, because the SDS doesn't give it to you. It's not required, and I would say probably 75, maybe even more. maybe even 85% of the SDS I see today make no mention of the NFPA 704 system or the HMIS system. So you're really putting the operator at you get a new chemical in with a new SDS and it doesn't provide that information. The safety group or the EHS group is going to have to use like NFPA 400, which is the hazardous material standard. It has a big table in it and says, here's the chemical, here's the CAS number, and here's the fire, health, and reactivity numbers for that chemical. But for example, I'm working with a client that's brand new, state of the art, cutting edge technology, and we're getting these SDSs in, and they don't even reference NFPA or 70, NFPA 704 HMIS, and
Yep.
so we're having to use the pictograms and so forth on the secondary containers because nobody knows, and the SDSs aren't worth the paper they're printed on. We have to go
Mhm.
back to the manufacturer who's usually outside the United States and say, look, we need the LEL, we need the flash point,
Yeah.
we,
Mhm.
we need the vapor pressure because it's not applicable as your SDS says. You just haven't done the testing.
Right.
Um, so it does cause issues in this day and age because a lot of the SDSs don't provide that information.
Right. Yeah, I've had to go back and call them up and say, hey, look, I read this whole thing from cover to cover to cover. I just don't see your diamond on here. Help me out with that. And everybody's been great. And for the most part, they've sent it over to me. There have been a couple of companies that either the person was new or they weren't really sure who to ask or call, and that took a couple of days. But luckily, everybody has gotten back to me. Certainly not as fast as I want, but they all got back to me at least.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Just imagine if you were the operator on the floor
oh,
and
you would
you didn't
totally be
catch it.
screwed.
Yeah,
Yep,
you didn't catch
exactly.
it as the EHS leader, and the operator spills it, gets it on their hand, and or they want to transfer it into a container, and they're told to use the diamond or the HMIS, and the SDS doesn't provide that information. I mean, you and I have been doing this for decades, and sometimes we read the SDS and we're like, "Gee, I don't, it doesn't tell you the
Exactly.
boiling point, right?" So, I
Yep,
mean, it doesn't tell you the flash point, and it's a flammable liquid. We
yep,
literally have flammable liquid SDSs that don't even provide flash point, LEL, UEL, or vapor pressure or boiling point. So there's no way to determine whether it's a 4, 3, or 2, or a 1.
yep,
Um,
yep.
of course, on the front, they say it's an extremely flammable liquid, right? Or it's highly flammable, and they have the
Mhm,
dangerous on there and the whole 9 yards. But then
mhm.
they don't provide that information in section 9, and it really causes a lot of confusion. But anyway, that's my spill
Exactly.
on labeling secondary containers.
Brian, that was really awesome, bud, and I totally blew it with the whole sharing of screen and all that
Oh,
kind
you're
of
right.
stuff. So I have to go back and get myself a little more jazzed up on this thing. Um, Thank you so much for sharing your time and all that good stuff. Could you spend a couple seconds, let folks know how they can find you? Because I'm sure somebody will listen to this and say, I got to call Brian. I got to get a little more info on this whole thing.
So the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, safetyeng, SAFTENG.net. There's a contact button on there. You can email me. My phone number's on there. And then if you want a copy of the presentation, since we're doing this in open forum, I will make the presentation available to anybody. You don't have to be a member. So far, it's been under membership, but I will open that up to anybody who listens to this and wants to go to the website. You just look in the articles posted. It should be up towards the top. And you can download the PowerPoint and go through it and get it right in your head. Or if you want to challenge me, feel free to email me or text me. I'm always up for a good debate.
Mhm.
Um, but and then of course you can always follow me on my social media groups on LinkedIn and Facebook.
Awesome, Brian. And with that, we have to go ahead there and wrap it up. I got to zip off for a conference call. I want to thank everybody for joining me. This was episode 301 with Bryan Haywood, and we talked about the topic of secondary chemical labels, but of course, we deviated from that.